Hello, this is David, and in this clip I want to continue with the notion that the flow properties of the blood that go to the placenta are determined by an arteriovenous malformation-like network within the myometrium and endometrium of the gravid uterus, and that this involves both large and also a very complex arborization of flaccid, thin-walled vessels that can't be argued to be arterial capillaries or venous capillaries because they're just part and parcel of this large AVM. And that network then links into the placenta and is from where the blood flows into the maternal space. And that the flow properties of that myometrovascular network that gets linked into the placenta is mainly determined by remodeling of intramyometrial vessels, and that the remodeling of the more superficial spiral arteries are just what actually create the links as opposed to the flow properties, and also primordially they create the space where the placenta grows. And that's based on my intuition as a pathologist. But a counter argument that's been made, people have said to me, but hey David, we see in series such as Dr. Hertig's series, where if you look at hysterectomies and take serial hysterectomy, look at a lot of hysterectomy specimens and then find cases where there were, let's say, unknown pregnancies, and therefore you could actually see early embryos, and that's what Dr. Hertig did in the 60s, then you could actually see what the very early outer cell mass and forming trophoblast looks like. And what there seems to be is this sort of fenestration, these holes, these labyrinths that forms within this outer cell mass. And people say, oh, okay, that's it. And then, out here is where the boundary gets created, and then the maternal blood comes in, but the space of the placenta, the contour, the topology of the maternal space has already been remodeled within this sort of trophoblastic compartment itself. So somebody kindly sent me Dr. Hertig's photos, and I had an opportunity to look at them myself, and that's not how I interpret them. So what I see when I look at Dr. Hertig's photos is I see, yes, you have your inner cell mass, and let's say your bilaminar disc, etc., and then it's surrounded by this sort of extra embryonic mesenchyme, and that's surrounded by this primordial trophoblastic layer, and indeed it does begin to fenestrate. It does. And you start to see these plexiform fenestrations. But ultimately, the way I see it, is what sort of happens is that the fenestration almost becomes a cavitation. And that these trabeculi, the labyrinths that you see, are not reflected in the final structure of the placenta. Rather, they almost disappear. And what happens is you get cavitation, and like a lot of times in the body, the inner part of the wall could almost be sort of like a visceral compartment, and the outer can almost be sort of like a parietal compartment. The inner portion of this cavitated trophoblastic mass hugs these extruding tongues of extraplacental of extrafetal or extraembryonic mesenchyme, and that extraembryonic mesenchyme forms the inner matter, forms the mesenchyme of the villi. And the very outer aspect, the syncytiocytotrophoblastic layer, is the inner part of this cavitating trophoblastic mass. We could almost call it the parietal part, the visceral part, that hugs these extruding tongues, these extruding tongues of extraembryonic mesenchyme, and that's here. And the outer part of this trophoblastic mass actually is the part, and you see this if you look carefully at Hertig's photos, is the part that invades vessels, and they invade this pre-existing plexus of complex maternal flaccid vessels within the decidua, and creates really part of the contour of the placenta. So that the contour of the placenta is sort of formed in two ways. One, by the inner growth properties of this extruding extraembryonic mesenchyme that formed the branching villi, but also the maternal space is also formed by this advancing border of extravillous trophoblast that goes into the maternal spaces and forms, in a sense, the evolving early placental space, the maternal space, and ultimately these coalesce and form the space of the placenta proper. So that the ultimate contour of the placenta is likely determined both by the intrinsic branching properties of the extravillous mesenchyme, and which we could consider that, let's say, the visceral layer of this trophoblast for the sake of argument. The visceral layer, and then also, this advancing extravillous trophoblast that invades the maternal spaces. But my main point is that that's my interpretation of Hertig, is that it doesn't come out to me that the labyrinthine cavitation in this early mass is what forms the contour of the villi. That's not true at all. And it's actually this cavitation that forms the space of the placenta. That's true. But it cavitates. It totally cavitates. And the contour of the branching villi are formed by these extruding extraembryonic mesenchyme, and this advancing layer, this sort of layer of extravillous trophoblast, also form the contour by invading the maternal spaces. So that's one line of evidence that I want to forward. The next thing is that I had the privilege of looking recently at an accreta case. And at a case of placenta increta, actually, that resulted in hysterectomy. And what I noticed in that case is that really the implantation, so if we imagine that this is the placenta, and then this is the myometrium, and this is the interface here, so this is the placenta, and then this is what's left. The myometrium gets quite attenuated. This is what's left of the myometrium, and then this is the implantation, or the boundary, the maternal fetal interface. So, number one, it was obvious that the myometrium was highly attenuated, and the placenta had this sort of pushing border infiltration. And for the sake of this schematic, I've made the placenta much thinner. In fact, the placenta is much more convoluted. But what I'm showing here is you could just imagine these ramifying villi that bifurcate, and then you get stem villi that anchor down, and the purple here represents fibrin. But what you see is, if you look in the myometrium, you see these large vessels about at the inner, let's say if you go from the serosa, you go 1/3 in, you see these large vessels that are thick-walled vessels, but you also see these massively expanded, thin-walled spaces, and altogether the structure looks very much like an AVM. There's no doubt about that. And then if you look up at the placenta, it looks very much like this part here, looks very much like the placenta that we receive in pathology, except that there is no decidua, and instead of decidua you get myometrium. But beyond that, it looks very much like the placenta that you receive in pathology, except that instead of decidua you see myometrium, and one little other difference. If you look carefully, you see sometimes in this implantation fibrin there are gaps, and the villi are growing through, and where they're growing into is vascular spaces that reflect a continuity between the maternal space and these large flaccid vascular spaces. And so you see the villi sometimes growing in between gaps in the fibrin into these vascular spaces that are exactly just the same as these vascular spaces, that clearly represents links between this plexiform, I'm going to call it arteriovenous malformation, and the maternal space of the placenta, and you actually see it. And then you see contoural irregularities, where, for example, most of, it almost looks like there's a single plane where the fibrin is, but then occasionally the villi will go deeper and invade like a vascular space that actually goes deeper beyond the regular plane, and you could see them going in. and then the fibrin sort of reduplicates, and then you see the fibrin reduplicating and getting deeper. And it's sort of interesting because if you go back and you look carefully at placental specimens that routinely you get in pathology, you do see gaps in the fibrin layer, and almost invariably you see villi growing into those gaps. And so often we just say, oh, okay, it's some kind of artifact, it's a disruptive artifact, but that discontinuity is probably a real discontinuity, and it reflects areas where the negative space would be what? If we could get the complementing decidua, what we would see are these thin-walled flaccid vessels, and then the villi growing in, and then probably, if we were to have full access, then around here we would see the reduplicated fibrin layer. Okay, so that's what the accreta looks like to me, and so that's the other line of evidence. And so to me, from Hertig, I actually think what I could appreciate is I appreciate this sort of remodeling of this pre-existing plexiform decidual vessels. It's part of creating the contour, and also the accreta suggests to me that's sort of what's happening. And then the next question that I'd just like to talk about very, very quickly is, if we're to assume that all of this, as very, very nicely laid out, in the Schaap paper, that all of this here represents this myometriovascular type of arteriovenous anastomosis, that the placenta always has this latent capacity to form, how does that get formed in pregnancy? And in the Schaap paper, they showed very nicely that this AVM persists even after the uterus contracts, even 1 to 2 weeks after the baby is out, which suggests to me that this AVM, because one of the thoughts I thought maybe it's a function of the uterine expansion, and that sort of, that it's a function of the uterine distension, that what brings out the AVM is the distension, and that doesn't seem to fit with the fact that it seems to persist. Those flow properties, as shown by Schaap, persist after contraction. So the other possibility that it's a dynamic remodeling done by sort of, that it's a dynamic remodeling that occurs, that you open certain channels that didn't exist before by sort of hormones of pregnancy or autocrine or paracrine, sort of factors of pregnancy, such as, let's just start speculating wildly, nitrous oxide or VEGF, but that also doesn't fit with the fact that it seems to persist. And it was really nicely shown by them to persist sonographically using high-flow Dopplers even 1 to 2 weeks after the pregnancy. So the other thing is it could actually relate to the flow, that if you have high flow in from the arcuate artery, the high flow themselves create this remodeling, but I wouldn't favor that. I actually favor, and I think their paper showed that it's a static structure, well, or at least a temporary static structure, and it's caused by a true remodeling, and that's caused by the deeper invasion of extravillous trophoblasts into so you get these sort of deeper invasion of these extravillous trophoblasts that actually get into the deeper myometrium and cause this remodeling. And therefore, it's my contention that the flow properties, that the high conductance, low resistance flow that ultimately goes into the maternal space is caused by the remodeling that occurs here and not by the remodeling that occurs in the spouts of the spiral arteries. But, that needs to be further developed. But I think if we were to do fluid mechanics, like fluid modeling from an engineering perspective, I think we would find, this is my hunch, that we would find that this anastomosis model, that this AVM model, that has these sort of larger arteriovenous anastomosis and then these plexiform small flaccid arteriovenous anastomosis that go all the way into the endometrium. And we see that in any AVM. We see a few large vessels communicating and then these sort of cavernous type of small vessels that are neither arteries nor veins but that are thin-walled and plexiform, and that's the link between the maternal circulation and the placenta, and I actually think that those plexiform vessels are actually what the early forming placenta grows into. And I guess I would also point out that in Schaap's paper it's very, very, very interesting, because what he could show in the paper, and it's beautiful, is that you do see evidence sonographically of the existence of this AVM even from around 7 weeks or earlier. But the blood doesn't enter the placenta until around, and this is consistent with what Burton says, until around 11 to 14 weeks. And so probably what happens is there's a different type of circulation, and I won't get into that now. There's a different type of circulation or a different type of way to feed an early placenta. And the placenta is in a sense waiting for the right flow properties to be created, which occurs around 11 to 14 weeks. And then once that happens, the channels of communication are opened. You could think that one way of saying it is that the trophoblastic plugs are broken, and you could see all these fibrin plugging, and then we allow, genuine maternal blood to actually come in and create the hematochorial placenta. And with that, I'll just end this clip.